You may know where I'm going with this next, given the namesake of the show and whatnot, but the fiat currency central banking complex is by definition imposed by fiat. It is involuntary, technically, in terms of the rules of the game are changed all the time, right? We don't know how many US dollars are in existence. We don't know the criteria for deciding. We don't know the shareholders of the central bank. We don't know the inflation rate. We don't know where the money is. It's a black box, as I was describing to you earlier. Would that have some impact on us psychologically, playing this game where the rules are changing all the time? And as a secondary question to that, is there any justifiable use case for fiat in human relations?
Well, kids don't like games that have rules that change. You know, that's the equivalent of a constitutional crisis, essentially. Like if you're arguing about the rules of football, you're not playing football. I suppose you're engaged in politics, and so that's not fun. And especially in the earlier stages of child development, this is something Piaget pointed out too, children tend to regard rules as unshakable moral axioms, and as anybody who breaks the rules as a heretic and a danger. Later, children can start to understand, some children become sophisticated enough as adults to understand that people are not only those who abide by rules, but those who formulate rules. But that requires a fairly sophisticated level of psychological development. But mostly, we don't like changing rules. You know, I mean, you can have pretty harsh parents, and as long as they're predictable, you can do just fine, but it has to be predictable. But if you have the sort of parents who are changing the rules nonstop, it's like, well, you can't derive any certainty from your surroundings. And you might say, so what? It's like, well, no. Your response to uncertainty, your response to involuntary uncertainty is a stress response. And that ages you and hurts you. And if there's enough uncertainty, it depends on you to some degree, because some people can handle more uncertainty than others, all things considered. But generally speaking, we don't like uncertainty at all. I mean, that's why, for example, all of you are sitting facing forward in your chairs. And if one of you was sitting in this auditorium with their chair reversed, looking at the other direction, there'd be a space around that person. And that's because you want all the primates you don't know to do exactly what they're expected to do when you walk into a room full of strangers. And if they don't, if they evince any behavior that's outside of the domains of civilized predictability, everyone becomes extremely uneasy, very, very rapidly. So we want certainty.
Right,
we want predictability. And so if the rules of the game change on us, well, we can't get a purchase on things, so to speak.
So in the fiat currency complex, not only do we have a less economic model where it has to expend energy on enforcement and protecting its turf that doesn't exist in the voluntary game of Bitcoin, but we also have a system that's driving people crazy, right? You can't even preserve your wealth across time in fiat currency. You don't have property rights. So in that world where you cannot store the fruit of your labor across time, how can you establish a relationship that's predictable with the world and get ahead? It just seems like a system that is designed to break down, sort of axiomatically deduced as we're doing here, but also historically, they all fail. And with that failure comes the disintegration of civilization. Mises wrote about the Austrian business cycle theory, which I know you've talked about. I would expand that out to a civilizational cycle theory. We've had the boom and bust of civilization based on the corruption of money. So is it ever justified? Because this seems, and we'll get into truth.
Well, I think it's suboptimal. You know, ever is a large term, right? I mean, people suggested, for example, that the COVID epidemic was of sufficient potential magnitude to justify policies that essentially relied on force. Because, let's be clear about this. Mandate's a point of the gun, fundamentally. Because, and you say, well, no, not really. Yes, really. Because not immediately, right? There's steps in between you and the gun, but that's still what's at the basis of it. And I would say, I think this is a good rule of thumb, and I think it's worth applying to all of your affairs. If you have to enforce with force, with compulsion, That's the sign of a suboptimal strategy, at minimum.
Right.
Now, is that ever necessary? Well, yes, unfortunately, it is necessary, and it's necessary. You talked a little bit about psychopathy. You know, the question is, what do you do with people who won't play by the rules, no matter what the rules are? Well, and you think, well, in an optimally structured society, no such people would exist. It's like, good luck with that theory. Well, lots of people believe that. The Rousseauian types, and they're usually social utopians. This is why the communists regarded criminals as they weren't enemies of the state, because they were criminals because they were victims of a corrupt system. And if the system had been optimally structured, there wouldn't be any criminals. And so you could hardly blame the poor criminals. You could certainly blame the political prisoners, by the way, under that system. But you had to actually feel sorry for the criminals. It's like, you're a fool if you feel sorry for people who are truly criminal, because they sure bloody well don't feel sorry for you. And you might think, well, there's no people like that. It's like, that means you haven't met one. That's all it means. So there's in every society, there's a small proportion of people who will use deceit, compulsion, extortion to gain their ends. And
so in response to that,
but in
a non-responsive situation, it seems difficult to justify, at least.
Well, as I said, it's at least suboptimal,
yes,
right?
okay.
I mean, if this theory is correct, or if this theoretical approach is correct, and I think there's all sorts of markers of its suboptimality. One would be, you don't want to play with someone who is forcing their game on you.
Right.
That's not trivial, because you think, well, why use the phraseology of game and play? Well, play actually turns out to be something of far more significance than we might think. You know, it seems likely that when you go to a movie, you're playing. That's a form of pretend play. It's a form of imaginative play. Whenever you're doing anything you really want to be doing, you're playing. And so the notion that optimally structured systems operate under the necessity of fostering voluntary play, that's a hell of a good idea.
Right.
And one of the things I really like about that idea too, this is really cool. So I've been beating the drum, I suppose, to some degree, making the case that there's an unholy alliance, you might say, between postmodern theorists and neo-Marxists. And you know, the neo-Marxist types, let's start with the Marxists, we'll get to the neo-Marxists momentarily. The Marxists have a particular view of history. And the view of history is basically an economic view, and I won't argue about the utility of that momentarily, but it's a particular economic view, and the economic view is essentially that there is an exploiting class, and there is an exploited class, a bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and the reason the exploiting class, the bourgeoisie, have excess resources is because they've basically stolen the excess labor of the proletariat for their own nefarious means, and inappropriately, and as a consequence, because property is theft under this sort of theoretical rubric, we need a revolution to
abolish private property.
Yes, and that's right, and to bring the utopia into being. Well, so what's interesting about that, there's many things, but one of the things that's most interesting is that theory is basically predicated on the idea that the relations between people are governed by force, by power, right? By compulsion. And the communist types lay that at the feet of capitalism, which is, I think, the most clueless thing they do, which is really saying something, because there's no shortage of clueless things they do. And so to find the most clueless thing that's quite something. But you know, because to equate the use of compulsion with capitalism just strikes me as absolutely preposterous. I mean, you could say capitalism, if you were cynical, you could say, well, capitalism is one manifestation of the proclivity to use compulsion, and that would be a more appropriate argument. But to equate the two...
Well, and in pure capitalism, there's no compulsion, right?
Well,
it's all mutual voluntary exchange.
Right. Well, I certainly wasn't making a case for the communists,
Yeah.
but the case I wanted to make is, you might think, well, if it's not power, if it isn't the willingness and ability to use compulsion to govern our social relations, like if it isn't mutual exploitation, what might the antithesis of that be? The opposite of that? What else could it be? And I think it's the spirit of play.
So let me...
So...
Thank you.